Monica and I decided to do our diagnostic manual critique on the Poec, or the Proficiency in Oral English Communication. It's an assessment battery of accented oral English that looks at non-native English speakers and evaluates the degree and source of their accent problems. For this test, it's appropriate to evaluate speakers who possess good English language skills and hold a 7th grade or better vocabulary level. The problem is their oral communication skills are adversely affected due to their accented speech. So the Poec intends to identify specific instances where communication breakdowns may occur and in turn properly address who accent modification is best suited for. Determining an accent as problematic is a complex process. According to ASHA, accent is defined as a phonetic trait from a person's original language, L1, that's carried over to a second language, L2. According to this definition, foreign accent is composed strictly of phonetic differences. The Poec, however, defines accent in a broad way that has not yet been examined by other assessment tools. The Poec tests face validity, but their validity has not yet been empirically tested. The Poec measures a variety of oral abilities, including articulation, intonation, auditory discrimination, as well as pragmatics. This is because accents can be influenced by all these factors. It's also noted that the pragmatic component of the test is considered extremely important as part of the overall profile of the client. However, evaluating pragmatics in a single encounter can be extremely challenging.
The Poec, if administered before and after an accent modification program is implemented, can also serve as a measurement of client progress. Ideally, the test is administered in a single session, which consists of 6 subtests and 2 additional speech samples. The examiner should have specific background in speech-language pathology or advanced linguistics or second language acquisition. Administration of the test requires approximately 60 minutes, and another 45 to 60 minutes are required for analysis. High-quality voice and or video recordings are recommended. The following is a description of the subtests of the Poec and what each is intended to assess. Subtest 1 is background information and the first spontaneous language sample. Background information on the client and behavioral information on his or her coping skills in daily communication are noted. It is also the first of the 3 speech samples. The examiner begins evaluating the speaker's effective use of communication at that point. Subtest 2, basic word level intonation. 24 stimulus words that sample the 8 basic word level intonation patterns of American English are used. Correct pitch and syllable stress are also used, where the examiner listens for appropriate pitch and stress. In this phase, dictionary intonation is used, where pitch or stress is either right or wrong. This is also necessary for intelligibility. There should be little confusion in the listener's mind. Subtest 3 is basic normal intonation for lengthier messages. 2 key elements to consider in determining the correct response are whether the stress is on the correct word, and whether the pitch contour or inflection goes in the appropriate direction. The examiner is trying to determine the client's habitual intonation patterns in normal messages. Subtest 4, articulation. The client will say the word presented and then make up a sentence using that exact word. The examiner evaluates the client's articulation and records only the errors using IPA narrow transcription symbols. Subtest 5 is contrastive intonation, stress shifts. The examiner will assess the client's ability to use critical conversation rules of intonation. How well does he or she change stress or alter pitch, intensity, or phrasing to match the speaker's focus of attention? Eye contact is important for fostering meaningful conversation patterns. The examiner's speech rate and stress should not deviate from normal conversation patterns, which means don't give the test taker the answer. Subtest 6 is auditory discrimination. The examiner will ask the client to turn around, or the examiner covers his or her mouth when reading the stimulus words. The examiner then asks the client to tell him or her whether the 2 words are the same or different. Subtest 7 is the supplemental speech tests. The client is asked to speak for 5 minutes in a monologue situation. The examiner may determine the topic. The second sample involves situation, where client interacts with someone else, using the phone or speaking to another person in the room. The goal is to see how the client deals with communication by phone or making small talk with someone else. The analysis portion, articulation, determines the vowel and consonant proficiency of the client. An example of this would be if there is final consonant deletion or R coloring. The language analysis are the sentences from subtest 4, conversation from subtest 1, and content of the additional speech samples in subtest 7 will be examined for possible language-based deficits. That would mean grammatical error patterns, vocabulary inadequacies, word-finding difficulties, etc. It is not a sophisticated linguistic analysis. Pragmatics are analyzed where the clinician scores the client based on a rating scale of 4 to 1, where 4 is the appropriate and 1 is inappropriate. The examiner considers the speaker's ability to effectively control and participate in a variety of communication settings. Auditory discrimination is from subtest 6, where the examiner will analyze errors to see if a particular error pattern occurs. Are vowels more easily misunderstood than consonants? Does the word position significantly influence error? Intonation will be analyzed by word level, normal intonation for lengthier messages, contrastive intonation, the stress shifts, speech samples, intonation notes, and the rating scale 4 to 1.
So according to what we learned about dumping it in the chocolate, our field of communication sciences and disorders is hardly exempt from doing so. So this led Monica and I to explore the potential overgeneralizations of who may qualify for an accent modification program. So by investigating the Poec, we found that there was a very limited evidence base. According to the statistical design portion of the assessment, the primary validation concern is to provide users with evidence that the Poec successfully differentiates between accented and native speakers, that it provides profiles that point to specific and treatable difficulties, and that interventions based on the Poec performance result in improvements. During the pilot testing of the Poec, there were concerns with both the concurrent and predictive validity of the subtests and with the instrument as a whole. So the test developer stated that she intended to further investigate 3 specific areas of the assessment. The first threat to validity that the developer poses involves differentiating between the accented and native speakers. So do the scores of accented speakers on the test significantly differ from scores of native speakers? To determine this, 60 clients will be assessed, 20 Chinese speaking, 20 Spanish speaking, and 20 native English speakers, all who volunteered to participate. And the following scores for each client were used, and she measured them on an overall ranking, and then number of word level articulation errors, number of sentence level articulation errors, number of word level intonation errors, number of sentence level intonation errors. She also looked at their pragmatics, which is their nonverbal behaviors, verbal behaviors, and the listener awareness, the speech rate deviance, and the number of incorrect auditory discriminations, as well as a personal attitude score. So basically how the speakers felt about themselves. So the developer stated that we will do t-tests of differences between accented and native speakers on each measure, 1 through 11 as I listed, with the expectation that each will produce a significant difference in the direction expected. So for example, accented speakers will produce significantly more articulation errors. Correlations, if there were any, between the overall rankings would be determined, and scores that didn't differentiate accented from native speakers would be regenerated before they were correlated with that overall ranking. The second concern that the developer addressed was whether or not the scores on the Poec are significantly related to scores on other measures of the same phenomenon. As we previously spoke about, there really is little research that exists on the Poec, and currently the only evidence-based test available is the more recent from 2007 Comprehensive Assessment of Accentedness and Intelligibility, or the CAAI from SHA. In an attempt to establish concurrent validity, the developer's investigation would use listener judgment and speaker dissatisfaction as they disclosed A, speaker intelligibility, B, speaker effectiveness, and C, speaker experience of dysfunction. It was predicted that intelligibility scores would significantly correlate with scores produced by the Poec. Conversely, in an article we found regarding the validity of the Poec screener, studies suggest that disagreements exist in literature regarding the relationship between accents and intelligibility. The developer says that she plans to create a correlation matrix to allow examination of the size and significance of correlations obtained from the scores of the Poec and their overall ranking of those 11 subcategories. She claims that the basis for responding to the post threat will incorporate portions of the assessment of intelligibility of dysarthric speech. That she plans that to use this assessment for a motor speech disorder can help establish a correlation with a speech difference. However, according to ASHA, speech language pathologists should have the adequate knowledge and skills to distinguish a speech disorder from a speech difference, which is necessary when providing elective accent modification assessment, and especially when treating those who wish it. Again, it appears that the act of dumping the chocolate is evident.
In order to assess the speaker effectiveness, the following would be assessed by a group of native speakers listening to samples of the 60 Poec participants: clarity of speech, educational level and type of occupation, fluency, and pleasantness. It is expected that the scores on the Poec will significantly relate to each attribute, as with intelligibility. After reviewing these factors, it appears that all of these criterion cannot be measured objectively. For example, although fluency can be objectively measured, pleasantness is measured subjectively and is individually perceived. So there is no way to record that on a scale or with numbers. The personal awareness scale will be used to assess the problems that accented speakers complain about. It is client-based and appropriate for assessing a speaker's experience of dysfunction. The personal attitude scale will also be used to compare correlations of intelligibility and speaker attributes, and are expected to be significant. The developer claims that the results that diverge from the expectations will be used to revise the Poec under the criterion measures. She reports that once the correlations are made and that the Poec is in fact assessing the criterion it was intended to assess, only then will she further investigate if improvement of the experience problems of accented speakers occurs. Having more than one trained observer score both native and accented speakers on the subtests across two administrations will address reliability or the external and internal consistencies of measurements. As previously discussed, 20 native speakers and 40 accented speakers will be scored on the Poec while being recorded. To provide test or retest data, the 60 subjects will be asked to return 1 week after the first assessment is administered to repeat this process. This was stated in the manual by saying each of the 4 trained observers will score a subtest of clients, their assignments overlapping so that 4 separate observations of each subject are provided. Then each observer will score the subtest repeated by any of his or her original clients, providing test-retest comparisons. The total possible agreements across the 4 observers for the first administration of the Poec are subject X scores X observers. The developer expects 90% or more agreements across the observers. So the practices of the developer of the assessment plan to attain these agreements based solely on inter-observer reliability or SCORA reliability, which is direct observation of discrete events. It should be remembered that observer differences are not the only source of error in observational studies. This was according to Caro, Roper, Young, and Dank in a 1979 paper. The developer intends to check test-retest reliability by comparing each observer's first scoring with his or her second scoring of a subject. It is expected 90% of the possible agreements will in fact occur. However, going back to the paper by Caro, Inter-observer reliability is often reported simply as a figure or a percentage with little or no explanation of how the figure was derived. So this is not a very reliable measure to give us information on the Poec. Although the time between both administrations of subtests is 1 week, the history or the events occurring between the first and second measurements, in addition to the experimental variable, for example, the possible early accent modification intervention, may affect the internal validity of these results. Practice effects, or the effect of the first test on the second test, also known as the learning to learn theory, may pose a threat to internal validity as well. Maturation within 1 week is less likely to affect the validity. So from what was gathered in the critiquing of this manual, it is evident that some of the practices in this assessment are dated and that there are possible unresolved threats of validity and reliability to this assessment. There is limited evidence base and appears that generalizations were made which would attribute to the theory that the test developers were unable to avoid dumping it in the chocolate. As stated previously, the developer plans to further assess validity and reliability to address these posing threats. However, this was conducted in 2007, and 5 or 6 years later, we still have not seen any revising or updated Poec tests.
Okay, and we hope you learned a little bit more about the Poec now, and that's all.